Okay. Here, thank Uncle Pat.
Okay, so if we get, so I will tell anyone who's participating, any of the attendees who are participating from home can ask a question in the chat and I'll relay it to you.
Fine.
So if you want to go ahead and presentation.
Oh,
And
this
then
is the only live part? These are the only people that are coming in person?
we have 18 people registered, so it's just, you know, it's a hard thing for us to tell if people are going to come.
You don't know if they're coming or not. All right, awesome. Very good.
Oh, yes. So, thank you for coming tonight to hear about the navigation case. Tonight's speaker, John Happ, will talk about his book, and then he'll take questions at the end. So, for people participating online, you can send a question in the chat once the presentation is done, and I will relay the question to John, and he can answer it. And then this is being recorded for the library YouTube channel, so people can watch it later if you want to refer people to it, and people who couldn't attend tonight can watch it later on YouTube. So there you go.
Excellent, thanks. Is that, which camera am I looking into, by the way?
That is for the people online. But you can address.
Yeah, very good. All right, well, super. Thanks a lot for being here tonight, virtually and in person. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Also, it's a great source of pride. Our family arrived in Winnetka as one of the first pioneer families in 1843, settling at the village green. And we still have a blacksmith shop in town, occupied by another business at this point. I'm the 6th generation of that first person that came out, and in the audience tonight is the 7th and 8th generation of our family. So it's great for me to be here. The other reason why I'm happy to be here is because my father obviously grew up here, and he actually got his flight wings, his pilot's license at Lewis University at the time down in Joliet, Romeoville, today in Romeoville. And he got his license in 1940, before Pearl Harbor, before the war. And then he got his undergraduate degree at Loyola University in the city. So I've been touring the Midwest a bit to make this presentation. I had 100 people at Loyola the other day, 75 people at Lewis University hearing about their alum. My presentation today, story about my father and his service, it's about the greatest campaign in the history of the U.S. Air Force. The battles took place in a land that I barely ever heard of, a land which today remains one of the most primitive places on Earth, New Guinea. The scene of the story is set just after the surprise bombing at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The main characters in my story are President Franklin Roosevelt, General Douglas MacArthur, a person you may not have heard of and deserves a lot more credit than what he's been given by historians, 5th Air Force Commander General George Kenny, and then the airplane that my father graduated to when he was in the service, the A-20. It's a 2-man fighter aircraft. General Kenny got his start in World War I, flying for the U.S. Army Signal Corps, which means he identified where the enemy troops were, enemy installations were, and reported back to the artillery so that they could, attack the enemy better. Air power in those flimsy one-man airplanes that they had at the time, biplanes. Everybody remembers the planes with 2 wings. No one in the higher echelons of the Army or the Navy had any faith in aircraft whatsoever. So in fact, after World War I, that Signal Corps and that Air Corps that had started for World War I was in fact closed down for more than a decade. They didn't believe it. It was useful. General MacArthur, who's really a main figure in this story, spent the greater part of his youth in the Pacific and was recognized as the political and military authority in the area. President Roosevelt is a bit in the background of this story, but the key point with Roosevelt is through his New Deal programs, trying to revitalize the economy during the 1930s when he got elected, aviation was barely a blip in gross domestic product, figures at the time. Aviation was still all negligible as an industry in the United States. But his New Deal policy helped get my father his pilot's license, in fact, and stimulated the growth of the airline industry in the United States. But again, in 1939, it wasn't even a blip in our economic production figures. But by 1945, because of Roosevelt's initiatives, and unfortunately because of the war, aviation becomes the largest industry in the largest economy on planet Earth, which is ours, the United States of America. The result of that New Deal policy, pushed along by the war, prompted the development of all sorts of different types of airplanes, and the advances in technology, radio, navigation, all sorts of electronic equipment that these guys had to learn about and master in their code work. That resulted in a wide variety of aircraft to be produced. And in fact, my father trained in 11 different types of aircraft before he got to this one. Each time in training, the size of the airplane was doubling, and the sophistication of the airplane was doubling as well. But this is the A-20, which he flew for the majority of the war. Just a little bit of biography about myself. Graduated from Marquette with a Spanish degree and with a business degree. I now speak 5 languages. I travel around the world for my day job, and I have original research articles on the side. It's kind of a hobby, but it's been very successful in such magazines as the Journal of the American Revolution, and on the other extreme, Atlantic Coastal Kayaker, for example. I have business articles published in Russia and Norway and Spain, and then every once in a while, for some reason, I get interviewed on Japanese television, even as recently as this past February. But here's the story. After sheltering 6 children and a grandmother and my parents over the span of some 40 years, our house was apprehensively cleaned out. The contents were distributed among us or dumped, and the house was put on the market. A lingering curiosity was stirred. When my mother presented me with this crusty leather briefcase. On the face of it, it's written, navigation, dead reckoning, type A4, specification numbers, order numbers, the National Briefcase Manufacturing Company. I had never seen it before in my life. I'd never seen it before in my life because my father never spoke much about his time in World War II. And through that case, I came to realize that my father had meticulously uncreased all his papers, organized his military orders, organized his photographs and souvenirs and correspondence from his time in the war, and tucked them very neatly into that, his pilot's navigation case. As I'm going through the papers, orienting myself to what I'm in the world I'm looking at, Randomly, a newspaper article falls to the floor. The article is describing a mission in New Guinea that caused horror and tragedy, quote unquote, horror and tragedy, and resulting in the biggest loss of men and aircraft in US Air Corps history. The fact that the episode involved my father piqued my interest, but larger questions remained unanswered. What was my father doing in New Guinea, of all places? What was any American doing in New Guinea, of all places? And if we were fighting the Japanese, why there? What was New Guinea all about? I cannot emphasize enough, and I'll say it probably a couple more times throughout the presentation, the man I knew as my father, growing up, was a mild-mannered, devout, church-going guy. He was a hobby pilot and a gardener. It was also the 1960s and 70s, the Vietnam era, when being in the military was not very popular. Kids were questioning what their parents were doing. Parents were questioning what America was doing, why we were doing it. As a young guy, I watched haunting and troubling TV images of battles in Vietnam, in distant jungles, helmeted men carrying rifles through tangled forests and jungles, not sure at all what was heading around the corner for them. We learned as kids of friends of my older brothers escaping to Canada to avoid the draft. It was gut-wrenching. I only recall that when asked about his service, my father would say, I was a pilot in New Guinea. I always thought he meant transport, hauling goods around, carrying beans to the front lines and going back to get more stuff to bring them forward. I was shocked. I was shocked to learn through the navigation case that he was a combat pilot. And I only learned it for the first time because of the navigation case. In fact, with this airplane, I didn't recognize, didn't know what it did. In fact, he flew 64 violent and deadly combat missions in what has come to be known as the greatest campaign victory in the history of the US Air Force. At the end of his tour, with the World War still raging, he was rotated off of the front line. He had served his time at the front lines, rotated to what was probably considered a benign transport role after all, based in Stout Field in Indianapolis. From there, in early 1945, he flew Battle of the Bulge, wounded, to hospitals closer to their native homes. He would pick them up in Presque Isle, fly them to Baltimore, fly them to Walla Walla, Washington, closer to their own native homes. And while no one would argue that medical evacuation transport missions were the same as combat missions, in that role, he went completely lost, missing and unaccounted for in the United States. This is the Southwest Pacific, 1942, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, when Japan was conquering everything in their path. That's the southern edge of Japan, all through here. China, Indochina, Hong Kong, Singapore, down into what used to be called the Dutch East Indies, or the Netherlands East Indies. This is the island of New Guinea. It lies just to the north of Australia, 95 miles across that strait there. It is 1,500 miles from end to end, from the Coral Sea in the southeast to the Halmahera Sea in the northwest. It's equivalent to flying from Chicago to Helena, Montana, for example, or from Chicago all the way to the northern tip of the Hudson Bay. A great distance. Shortly after Pearl Harbor, out here in Hawaii, General MacArthur, stationed in the Philippines, was chased from his command there in the Philippines by overwhelming Japanese air and sea power. Scrambling to prepare for war. America was neutral at the time. We were supplying guns and ammunition and boats to other countries, China and Great Britain, but we were neutral, officially neutral in the war. So we were unprepared. And therefore, because we had nothing in the way for ourselves of a military, so to speak, America's priority became building a supply chain from San Francisco and Hawaii down through Fiji, the Solomon Islands, past New Guinea, down to Australia, to build a supply chain of men and materials to get to the front lines. On the edge of that route, you see, sits New Guinea. But the problem is, Japan got there first. They dominated this very strategic natural harbor called Rabaul, and they reinforced it and strengthened it. It's surrounded by mountains, so they placed anti-aircraft guns there. It was very highly protected. It was considered the Pearl Harbor of the Southwest Pacific. The only Allied foothold in the area, the only place we had a base, was down here in Port Moresby, just across from Australia, 95 miles away. So as America ramped up for war across two oceans now, in Europe and in the Pacific, the Allied heads of state agreed among themselves to a policy of defeating Germany first. Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt. They decided that if they got together to stop Germany first, then they could turn their attention to the Pacific and fight off the Japanese. This was a major point. In practice, Germany first meant that 85% of American war material was to be committed to Europe to fight the Nazis. Directing Allied forces now from his new base in Melbourne, Australia, southern Australia, but lacking men and materials, MacArthur was obligated to fight defensive battles to protect Australia and his supply lines. Japan's war plan was to wear down the Americans and negotiate a settlement. They expected to keep a number of these formerly European colonies. They took French Indonesia from the French, they took Malaysia from the British, they took Indonesia from the Dutch. They expected to keep those colonies in a negotiated settlement to the war. They expected that America would be worn out and negotiate a settlement to the war so that they could keep some of those colonies. The war, therefore, devolved into faltering and tangled battles of attrition in the dense jungles of such places you might know as Guadalcanal, the Kokoda Trail, and the Coral Sea, where pestilence and malnutrition caused more deaths on each side of the battle lines, more than the enemy. Men, some women were dying of disease and even malnutrition at a rate higher than enemy guns and bullets. An Allied plan in the spring of 1942 to turn the tide of the Kokoda Trail battle by parachuting men and supplies into the area had to be aborted because they didn't have enough aircraft to carry out that mission. The Kokoda Trail went from Port Moresby up to Gona and Boona here on the north coast, but it's a one-man footpath, tangled, rock-strewn, tripped up by rivers, one person at a time to go through that trail. It was so thick and densely forested. Combat was considered to be a gridlocked standoff. Now, General Kenny is finally appointed to MacArthur's staff in the summer of 1942. But because of that Germany first policy, 85% going to Europe, 15% of men and equipment going to the Southeast Pacific, he only commanded some 260 aircraft. He's the big general, head of the 5th Air Force, but he only had 260 aircraft. And the quote is, many of them were unserviceable. Those planes had been delivered in Australia, broken down in segments, and many of the parts went missing. By the summer of 43, now some 18 months after Pearl Harbor, January, February, March, fighting in the jungles, April, May, fighting in the jungles, can't get through the jungles. After 18 months of that kind of battle, the Japanese repositioned some of their troops to the north coast, some strategic bases and port towns, and the Americans were finally able to carve out a little air base here close to the north coast of New Guinea called Gusa. That means that during the first 18 months of the war, when an estimated 24,000 live soldiers died, of which 17,000 were Australian troops fighting to stop this cascade of Japanese troops heading for their country, all of that combat, all of the casualties, disease, and death moved the battle lines in the Allies' favor just 200 miles from Port Moresby up to Gusa. 18 months of that, that's all the progress they could make. It was not until the fall of that same 1943, almost 2 years now after Pearl Harbor, when General Kenny's 5th Air Force was finally strengthened. He received 35 new bomb groups. For our purposes, that's a total of some 3,300 aircraft. And almost immediately, in contrast to that aborted Kokoda Trail airlift, where they were trying to airlift men and supplies into that battle, as opposed to that, on a day of notoriously bad weather in New Guinea, an operation was carried out in which 300 aircraft supported and defended a drop of over 1,700 troops into what's called the Nadzab opening. It's a river valley just a few miles south of the sea, a little bit north of Gusa. Flights of B-25, people like the B-25 aircraft. This B-25 finally arrives in theater, and it was able to, among many others, strafe and clear the area of the enemy to protect those parachuting men into that river valley. But again, that fortress of Rabaul that they have in the Pearl Harbor of the Southeast Asia is still looming above MacArthur, both figuratively and literally. So after all those months, those 18 months, for example, realizing the fruitlessness of traditional ground offensive, they were hoping to move battalions of men through the countryside as though they were in the north coast of France or rather the north coast of Africa with tanks and equipment, but they couldn't do that. Realizing the fruitlessness of that kind of action, but with his hands tied by the Germany First policy still, MacArthur devised the plan of leapfrogging past these various Japanese strongholds using the Air Force to cut the Japanese off from their sources of supply. As he was building his supply chain from Hawaii and San Francisco down through Fiji to Australia, he sought to break the supply chain from the Japanese north going south. So now I have some new history that's never been brought to light before the navigation case. As I said, Japan had been colonizing these islands since the very beginning of the war, since the weeks after Pearl Harbor. They were insinuating their forces along the north coast of New Guinea and in various other islands and ports from Japan. The key locations in New Guinea are known, and I'm sorry for the detail, but I need to do the detail in order to make my point. Goosap you had here, but 3 key locations were identified: Madang, Wewak, and Itep here that MacArthur wanted to break. But then American intelligence discovered that those 3 bases were being supplied by a massive port in a town called Hollandia, which the Japanese had been reinforcing and strengthening. And they felt good about where they were here, the Japanese did, because they thought they were out of range of American bombers, that American bombers couldn't fly far enough to attack them there. So they were very comfortably building that up. Throughout the early months of 1944, Allied pilots were tasked with slowing the enemy buildup by bombing and strafing those strategic enclaves throughout this vast 1,500-mile area. At the time, an expanding base at Wewak, quote, awed General Kenny and his men. They were unsettled by the fact that the Japanese had been receiving new men and hardware almost daily. It was estimated that a formidable 100,000 Japanese troops and hundreds of combat warplanes were stationed there. Madang, to the south, served as a depot and a logistics center partway between Wewak and Goosap, for example. The most distant target of the 3 was Itep, the third of those 3 that MacArthur had singled out. It was positioned some 400 miles to the northwest of Goosap, and yet still 150 miles south of Hollandia. My father's bomb group, flying mainly that A-20 type of aircraft, they all thought they were really cool, the bomb group. They named themselves the Roaring 20s. Factory specifications stated that those type of airplanes flew at 280 miles an hour with an estimated range round trip of 950 miles. Again, more detail than you want, but I need this to make an important point. Allied commanders detailed plans for my father's bomb group to harass the base at Itep and interrupt the Japanese there. Those assaults were also intended to test the ship's range. Is it really 950 miles? Is it 850 miles? Is it a little over 950? They weren't sure, but the factory said 950 miles. But the General Kenny also wanted to test the men's endurance. Could they really hold up over a 4-hour-long mission out and back? On just one of those missions, that airplane flies at treetop level, the A-20, and it attacks from a very low altitude. On just one of those missions, my father pulled his A-20 out of a dive, and his windshield exploded in his lap. He was hit by Japanese flak. The episode was recorded by his gunner sitting behind him. He kept the diary. The gunner's diary ends up in his nephew's hands. And while I'm working on this book, the nephew finds out about it and says, hey, I'm Adler's nephew. The gunner's name is Adler. Did you know about this? Well, I didn't know about that. So he contributed that to the story. I had no idea my father's windshield was blown out. And there's more detail about that in the book, with the book bin. The flight back after attacking Itep and getting his windshield blown out was still 2 hours over treacherous mountains and gurgling sea. It was a difficult flight back under any circumstances. As these bombing raids for MacArthur began to show results, however, the Japanese cautiously moved men and equipment back to Hollandia, 550 miles away, again, expecting to place them out of range of American bombers. But that presented MacArthur with a new dilemma. He was inadvertently strengthening a Japanese base further up their supply chain at Hollandia. So MacArthur invents a new attack plan to hold in place approximately 10,000 Japanese troops in the Madang area. And on March 12th, a stream of Australians, they laboriously reached to within 30 miles of Madang via those jungled inland routes, simulating a traditional ground offensive. From the sea, a platoon of U.S. troops landed on a nearby coast, representing another prong of the attack. The Japanese took the bait. They fell for this fake that MacArthur was putting on and interpreted those moves to be an allied plan to take Madang, portending another long, drawn-out battle of attrition, just what the Japanese wanted. As that battle raged, MacArthur's theatrics continued. He ordered more troops to land at Hansa Bay, threatening Wewak. Strong opposition from the Japanese was expected, and intelligence reports in fact confirmed that enemy troops were being transferred down from Hollandia again to confront the Allies in that battle. And again, this is a fake campaign that MacArthur's running, and it was working. Those harassing raids on ITEP from earlier told General Kenny he could get more than the 950 miles out of those airplanes and in fact reach Hollandia. MacArthur anxiously, and some say impetuously, ordered a massive knockout punch to overwhelm it. Pilot Len Happ of that bomb group wrote decades later, it was a very important mission because it was the final blow in the campaign known as MacArthur's triple play. The triple play was bypassing Madang, Wewak, and ITEP to take out Hollandia, which the Japanese never expected. In that same correspondence, my father wrote, and he's a captain in the Air Force and an operations officer with access to all these intelligence reports. He described the scene further. It was known we were going to operate the A-20 in the upper limits as far as gas and mileage were concerned, and the weather forecasts were marginal. On Sunday, April 16th, the men were briefed on their mission and assigned their roles. The overall attack included squadrons from multiple air bases, totaling an estimated 300 aircraft. My father wrote, quote, in fact, the whole damn 5th Air Force and 3rd Attack Group was deployed. From the start of the mission, crews could see bad weather building. Winds jostled the wings, and they rattled the pilots in their cockpits. Again, my father recorded, but we all took off because of the importance of the mission. Of the over 2-hour flight to their target, he added, I was leading a flight of 3 aircraft. We were to drop 500-pound bombs with a B-25, if I still have that. And let's see, 500 pounders with a B-25 and then hit the deck. Again, they're attacking from treetop level and hit the deck and strafe. The 2-man A-20 aircraft, my father's style of aircraft, could carry a load of over 24,000 pounds of bombs. The B-25, this massive ship here, has a crew of 11 and can carry up to 55,000 pounds of bombs. The A-20 were to come in low and drop their bombs from about 20 feet off the ground, treetop level, at a controlled speed of 280 miles an hour. The attack on Hollandia was a complete success. It was a complete surprise to the Japanese. 300 of their new airplanes on various runways were destroyed before they even got off the ground. Not one Allied plane was lost to Japanese countermaneuvers or anti-aircraft fire during the raid. However, while they were engaged in their attack, these 300 aircraft swarming around Australia, attacking, a full-scale tropical storm built up behind them, blocking their way home. New Guinea is about 3, 4, 5 degrees south of the equator. Intense equatorial heat ignited the mountains, bringing them to a steamy boil. Thick clouds rose and spilled into the valleys. The mass overflowed, inflating itself north to south, blocking the men's home, frothing across the island. In the gurgling, turbulent clouds and low on fuel at this point, many pilots simply lost their way, consumed in the grasp of the weather, never to be found again. Quote, experienced pilots reported that some planes just disappeared. Others crashed into the mountains or into the sea. In the journals of mission survivors are phrases like a solid wall of weather and the sea was whipped up into whitecaps by the wind. At MacArthur's headquarters, the mission was considered a great success. And just a week later, American troops landed at Hollandia. A week later, American troops landed at Hollandia almost without opposition. In this grand leapfrogging maneuver, MacArthur had split the enemy's defenses in half, leaving them behind here in the east, defenseless, without food, without access to their supply lines. In the end, the storm's toll on the Allies was devastating. The loss and destruction from that operation on Hollandia caused the loss and destruction of 37 airplanes with their gunners, with their pilots. Reported by the men of my father's bomb group almost exclusively as Black Sunday, it remains the largest Allied operational loss as opposed to combat loss in American history. It's recorded nowhere else. The triple play, Black Sundays recorded almost nowhere else except in the navigation page. You will find it in no biography of MacArthur. You will not find it at the MacArthur Foundation in Norfolk, Virginia, with whom I'm already talking. Incredible. Only found in the navigation case in my father's correspondence. We're getting there. The Japanese had conquered and evicted the Dutch from Western New Guinea and Indonesia, formerly Dutch East Indies, within the first weeks of the war following Pearl Harbor. Oil, vital to the Japanese economy and war machine, was found in abundance on New Guinea's Vogelkop Peninsula. So all the action is moving to here. Based in Hollandia, they're fighting further and faster to the northwest. This body of water is called Gelving Bay. I'll refer to that a little bit, but this is the Vogelkop Peninsula, oil rich. Controlling that area was one of the first achievements by the Japanese in the war. And according to one historian, commanders in Washington had looked at that region and projected production of as much as 16,000 barrels of oil a day. In July, 75 of my father's bomb group, wrong way, 75 of my father's bomb group struck an oil field and a depot called Bowela on the west coast of that Vogelkop Peninsula. From their base in Hollandia, the target was some 2.5 hours distant, which required a refueling stopover in Gelving Bay on a small island called Biak, But Biak was a very important and very gruesome battle as well, just to take that island. If you look closely, here's an A-20 emerging from the smoke after his bombing run. That black smoke, obviously oil burning. Later that month, the bomb group flew a dangerous low-level mission to bomb a Japanese seaplane base with supply transport barges in a port town called Kokas. The installation was located in Sikar Bay on the south coast of the Volga Peninsula. That was a 6.5 hour round trip mission to and from Hollandia. That, you might know, is the time it takes for a modern commercial jet to fly from New York to London. An amazing sequence of photos from that mission was captured, and it describes as clearly as anything what the pilots on New Guinea are facing, and again, flying these A-20 aircraft. Relieved and anxious at finishing his bombing run, this airplane, piloted by First Lieutenant James Nair with a Staff Sergeant Charles Ripley as his gunner, they were hit by anti-aircraft fire, rolled to the right. Out of control, that A-20 plunged into the bay. The descriptive images give an idea of how low the squadron was flying and at what speed by how quickly Nair impacts the water and how quickly his ship crashes. These are two photos from a sequence of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. He's already crashed in the sea. It's an indication of how low they were flying. It warrants emphasizing that that A-20 weighed 15,000 pounds empty, was over 17 feet in height, 47 feet in length, with a wingspan of just over 61 feet. And before our eyes, and those clicks of the camera, click, 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 we see this enormous machine shatter on impact with the sea, disintegrating. The sequence of photos was recorded automatically. Cameras were activated when his colleagues, another plane over here, his colleague's airplane opened his bomb doors to take pictures. The idea was to take pictures and assess the damage that they'd caused with their bombing run. But in this instance, it was Nair and Ripley's drama, their drama of death, in fact, that was caught in the lens. Here we go, we're finishing up now. In August of 1944, after weeks of intense aerial bombing, Americans landed fresh fighting troops at a beach called Amsterdam and on an island called Middelburg, all on that west coast, far west coast of that Volga Peninsula. In this scattered burst of aggression, specifically on August 6th, Australians reported that Japanese were fleeing various strongholds in that Gelving Bay area, headed for the west coast. They discovered Japanese resistance on the peninsula, regrouped at a town called Marakwari on the far coast again. Allied forces attacked them there via undefended beaches at a town called Sansapur. By the end of August, that port was taken and some 25,000 Japanese troops were isolated on the peninsula, trapped and cut off. Those men amounted to the final significant opposition on New Guinea. This was truly the first war of its kind and became the most successful demonstration of air power in United States history. The Japanese threat once reached Port Moresby, across the Torres Straits from Australia. During the first 18 months, I'm repeating, during the first 18 months of the war, an estimated 24,000 Japanese soldiers I'm sorry, an estimated 24,000 allied soldiers, our guys, died moving the battle lines just 200 miles in those first 18 months from Port Moresby to Guinea. When the 5th Air Force was finally reinforced, while still only receiving that raw material of personnel and equipment due to the Germany's first policy, the results and the statistics became amazingly clear. The progress made from Guinea to Hollandia in the first 4 months of 1944 alone moved the battle lines 500 miles, costing upwards of only, it's a horrible way to put it, costing upwards of 9,000 Allied ground and air forces nonetheless. Another 4 months later, from Hollandia to the edge of the Volga Peninsula, with the conquest of those oil fields and liberating that whole island in August of 1944, the 5th Air Force commanded air superiority over the 1,500-mile length of New Guinea. And if I haven't said it before, this island is the size of France and England combined, 1,500 miles end to end. It was there in New Guinea that General Kenny was the first in American history to achieve the now widely accepted principle that the first goal of any military conflict is air superiority. It's not come out until the navigation case. He's the first to achieve air superiority in the history of the U.S. Air Force. The Battle of New Guinea is unrivaled as the greatest victory in the history of the U.S. Air Force. The end. This is a picture of my father, a man outstanding in his field there in New Guinea. So we'll take any questions. Thanks.
Do you mind if I grab a book? I don't know what to do. Okay, so for anyone who is participating from home, this is the book, The Navigation Case by John Happ, and the Northbrook Book Bin is selling them, and we also have a copy on order for the library. It's not here yet, but it is on order if you're interested in checking it out or purchasing it. And I think did it come out this week?
No, the publisher made an extra effort to get some to the book bin for this event.
Okay.
The real release date for the public is November 23rd.
Okay.
So there are advanced copies at the book bin.
Yes, there are advanced copies at the book bin. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, and I can relay them to John.
Great. That's it.
Did you create that map yourself with the advanced
No.
years of advancement?
No, you were really paying attention, so I'll give you the true answer. That's part of the problem. Those arrows are Army movements, not Air Force movements.
Oh, okay.
The whole history is written by either Army guys or Navy guys.
Yeah.
And that's why the Air Force part is completely neglected. The Air Corps was a stepchild